The moment my nephew walked through my front door carrying a leather folder and a man I had never seen before, I did not stand up from my chair. I did not raise my voice. I set my mug down on the arm of the sofa, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at the two of them standing in the hallway of a house I had built before my nephew was old enough to walk, and I thought, very quietly, he has no idea what he is about to run into. He smiled at me the way people smile when they believe they are holding every card in the deck. It is a particular kind of smile, wide and practiced and just slightly too warm. The smile of a man who has rehearsed this moment and is pleased with how it is going so far. I had seen that smile before. I had seen it at Christmas dinners and at my retirement party and at my wife's birthday last spring, when my nephew had brought expensive wine and talked all evening about the property market in Ontario and how prices had peaked and how it was a remarkable time to think about the future. I had been thinking about the future for 2 years by then. He just didn't know it. Let me tell you about the property first, because without the property, none of the rest of it makes sense. I bought 43 acres of land in Grey County, Ontario, in the autumn of 1986. Paid for it with money I had saved working 14-hour days as a Finnish carpenter for 11 years. Money I had kept in a savings account at the credit union and never once touched, because I had made a promise to myself when I was 24 years old and completely broke, that one day I would own something no one could take from me. The land was mostly hardwood bush, with a creek running through the lower third, and a small clearing near the road where someone had tried and failed to run a dairy operation sometime in the 50s. I paid $68,000 for it. My wife Margaret thought I had lost my mind. She changed her opinion over the following 3 years as I framed the house up myself, ran the electrical with a journeyman license I had earned at night school, laid the plumbing, poured the basement floor, and chinked every gap in the timber frame with my own hands. By the time our son was born in 1989, we had a 4-bedroom home on 43 acres of Grey County with a wood stove in the living room, a wraparound porch I had milled from the trees I cleared myself, and a mortgage that we paid off 11 years ahead of schedule. Margaret painted every room while she was still nursing our son. I installed the kitchen cabinets while he slept in a carrier on my back. The county assessor valued the property last year at just under $2 million. I know this because my nephew mentioned it at nearly every gathering we had in the 18 months before everything fell apart. The way you mention the weather, casually, as though it is simply information and not the thing you are actually talking about. My nephew is my younger brother's only child. I watched him grow up at the same kitchen table where, 30 years later, he would try to take everything from me. When he was small, he used to follow me around the property, asking questions about the tools, about the timber frame, about why I built the bracing at a particular angle, and I answered every question patiently because I believed then, and still believe, that curiosity is the only thing worth encouraging in a young person. He went to university in Toronto and studied business and came back with an MBA and a wife named Courtney who wore expensive jewelry and talked about investment portfolios the way other people talked about the weather. I did not dislike her immediately. I want to be fair about that. It took closer to 6 months. They settled in Barrie and bought a house that was too large for 2 people, and took on a mortgage that must have kept both of them awake at night, though neither of them would have said so. They drove expensive vehicles and took expensive vacations and came home from those vacations with a slightly strained look around the eyes that told me the gap between how they lived and what they earned was wider than anyone was admitting. Margaret's health began to decline in the spring before everything happened. Her cardiologist called it atrial fibrillation, which is a condition that sounds manageable until you live with someone who has it, and understand that manageable means something different in a medical office than it does at 2 a.m. when the woman you have shared your life with for 38 years is sitting up in bed with her, hand pressed to her chest, trying to decide if this is the time she calls an ambulance. She was on medication. She tired more easily than she used to. The cold bothered her in a way it never had before, which is a difficult thing when you live in Grey County and your heating bill runs $400 a month from October to April. I think my nephew noticed her health declining at Easter dinner that year. I think he watched her sit down halfway through clearing the table and decided that her illness was a door he had been waiting to find unlocked. He called me in June on a Tuesday evening while I was on the porch watching the light go off the bush, and he talked for 20 minutes about estate planning. He used phrases like protecting what you've built and making sure the family is taken care of. He mentioned that a colleague of Courtney's worked in estate law and had helped several clients avoid significant probate fees by restructuring property ownership while the original owners were still alive and in good health. He said the words "in good health" with a particular emphasis that I understood immediately and chose not to acknowledge. I told him I already had a lawyer. I had used the same solicitor, a woman named Helen Park, who practiced out of Owen Sound, for nearly 22 years. She had handled my will, my power of attorney documents, and something else she had helped me set up 18 months earlier, which I did not mention to my nephew and had not mentioned to anyone. After we hung up, I called Helen. She picked up on the third ring. I told her about the conversation, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the particular way she has of delivering important information without drama, that she was glad I had called and that I should not sign anything. Not a power of attorney update, not a property transfer, not a gift letter, nothing, without calling her first. I told her I understood. She said she would update the file. I thanked her and went inside and told Margaret everything. Margaret cried for a while, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, not with surprise, but with the particular grief of a person who had hoped to be wrong about something for a long time and has finally stopped being able to pretend they were. When she finished, she dried her eyes with a dish towel, the same kind of dish towel she had been using in that kitchen for 30 years, and she looked at me and said, "I always wondered when it would come to this." I said I had wondered the same thing. We sat there for a while without talking, which is a thing you can do after enough years with someone. The pressure built slowly over the following months. My nephew visited more often, which would have been welcome if the visits had not had the quality of inspections. He walked through rooms he had never shown interest in before. He asked about the timber frame, about the property lines, about the condition of the well and the septic and the roof. He asked these questions in the voice of someone making a list. Courtney came with him sometimes and sat at the kitchen table and talked about how hard it must be to maintain a property this size at our age, how the winters were only getting more difficult, how she and my nephew had talked about how much they would love to help manage things if we ever needed support. She said support the way people say it when they mean control. In September, my nephew raised the idea of a power of attorney. He said it was simply a precaution, that with Margaret's health and my age, which he mentioned twice in the same sentence, it would give everyone peace of mind to have a legal document in place that allowed him to assist with financial decisions if the need ever arose. He had brought a form. He slid it across the kitchen table with a pen already uncapped. I looked at it for a long time. My nephew watched me with an expression of patient concern that had been practiced until it looked almost real. I said I appreciated his thoughtfulness and that I would have Helen review it before I signed anything. His jaw tightened slightly. He said Helen was a general practitioner and that this was a specialized matter. I said I had found Helen quite capable over the past 22 years. He said he would leave the form for me to look over. I set it on the counter and called Helen the moment his truck was out of the driveway. She told me the form was a general power of attorney with an unusual clause that would have given my nephew broad discretion over financial transactions with minimal oversight requirements. She told me not to sign it. She told me she would like to schedule a time to talk about accelerating something we had discussed but not yet finalized. That something was the reason, when everything fell apart in November, that I was able to sit across a kitchen table from my nephew and a lawyer I had never met and feel something close to calm. 18 months earlier, with Helen's guidance, I had transferred the property into an irrevocable family trust. Not in secret, the transfer was registered with the Ontario Land Registry, as all such transfers are required to be. But it had been done quietly, without announcement, in the measured way that Helen manages everything, and neither my nephew nor Courtney had any reason to think to look for it. The trust documents specified that the property could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the approval of a trustee committee that did not include my nephew, and that any attempt to compel such a transfer through legal pressure or fraudulent documentation would trigger an automatic challenge through Helen's office. Helen had also, at my request, given me something else. A small digital recorder, the kind that clips to the inside of a shirt pocket and runs for 12 hours on a single charge. She had explained that Ontario is a one-party consent province, which means that a person may legally record a conversation they are participating in without informing the other parties. She told me this in her careful way, precisely, without editorializing. I understood what she was telling me without her having to say it directly. I had carried that recorder in my shirt pocket to every conversation with my nephew and Courtney for the previous 4 months. The morning in November when they arrived with the stranger, I had already been awake for 2 hours. Margaret was in the hospital in Owen Sound. She had been admitted 3 days earlier after a difficult night, and her cardiologist was managing a medication adjustment that required observation. She was going to be fine. Her cardiologist had used those exact words. But she was not home, and my nephew, I realized later, had known she was not home before he arrived. Someone in a town this size always knows. The man with him introduced himself as a solicitor from a firm in Barrie. He set a folder on the kitchen table with the practiced ease of a man who has done this particular thing before. In other kitchens, with other elderly people sitting alone in houses their families have decided they can no longer manage. The folder contained 2 documents. The first was a statutory declaration claiming that I had demonstrated signs of cognitive impairment and that my nephew, as my closest available family member, was petitioning the court under Ontario's Substitute Decisions Act to be appointed as my guardian. The second was a property transfer agreement, a full transfer of the 43 acres and the house to my nephew's name, with a life tenancy clause that he explained would allow me to remain in the house until I died, as long as I was capable of independent living. He said capable of independent living in the same tone the other solicitor had used for in good health. I read both documents from the first line to the last without speaking. My nephew watched me with the expression of a man who believes he is watching the final moments of something. The Barrie solicitor talked while I read, explaining in measured language that this arrangement would avoid significant estate complications, that it was designed to protect my interests, that the cognitive assessment had been completed by a physician whose name I did not recognize, that everything had been done properly, and with my well-being at the center of it. When I finished reading, I set the papers down and folded my hands on the table and looked at my nephew. He was 41 years old. He had my brother's eyes, the same particular gray-green that I had known since my brother and I were children, sharing a bedroom in a farmhouse 2 counties east of here. I had changed my nephew's diapers once, in an emergency, when his parents were stuck on the highway in a snowstorm. He had been 2 years old and frightened, and I had talked to him in a low, steady voice until he calmed down. The same voice, as it turned out, that I used at that kitchen table. I said that I understood what they were presenting. I said that I could see considerable effort had gone into this. I said that before anyone signed anything, I would like to make 1 phone call, and that I would appreciate 2 minutes of privacy to do that. The Barrie solicitor started to explain that the petition was already filed with the court, and that the timeline was somewhat time-sensitive, which was a thing people say when they do not want you to call a lawyer. I said I would only need 2 minutes. I went to the bedroom. I closed the door. I called Helen. She answered immediately, which she had been prepared to do since I had called her the previous evening to tell her I believed tomorrow might be the day, and to ask her to please be available. She told me the injunction application was already prepared and could be filed within the hour. She told me the trust documents were on record at the land registry and could not be superseded by a private transfer agreement. She told me to go back to the table and tell them nothing about the trust, and to let the recorder run, and to call the OPP. I thanked her. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down at the table I had built from timber, milled on my own land. I looked at the Barrie solicitor and at my nephew. I looked at the folder on the table. I said, very calmly, that I would not be signing either document. My nephew's face changed. Not all at once. It shifted the way ice shifts in early spring, starting to crack somewhere underneath before the surface shows it. He said I was being stubborn. He said I was putting the family in a difficult position. He said that with Margaret in the hospital and the property unmanaged and my age being what it was, the responsible thing, the thing a reasonable person would do, was to accept the help that was being offered. I said that I appreciated his concern and that I had made my decision. The Barrie solicitor said the court petition was already in process and that if I refused to cooperate voluntarily, a judge would be making decisions about my living situation within 6 to 8 weeks. He said this with the practiced steadiness of a man who had used it as leverage before and found it effective. I said that was his prerogative and that I would be in contact with my own solicitor. I stood up from the table, which ended the meeting in the way that standing up ends a meeting when you own the house and the other people do not. My nephew left without looking at me directly. The Barry solicitor picked up his folder and was more professional about it, thanking me for my time in a neutral voice that suggested this was not the outcome he had expected, but that he had been paid regardless. I watched them back out of the driveway from the kitchen window. Then I stood there for a moment in the house I had built, listening to it settle in the November cold. And I thought about my wife in a hospital bed in Owen Sound, and about my brother who had no idea what his son had just attempted, and about the recorder still running in my shirt pocket. And I felt something that I would not call satisfaction. Not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sensation of a joint fitted correctly, a beam seated in its pocket, a thing built to holding. Helen filed the injunction application before noon. The land registry confirmed the irrevocable trust was on file and that the attempted transfer agreement had no legal standing. Helen also forwarded a formal letter to the Barry solicitor's firm advising them that the cognitive assessment submitted as the basis for the guardianship petition had been conducted without my knowledge or consent, in violation of established protocol, and that she was referring the matter to the Law Society of Ontario. The OPP arrived at my nephew's home in Barrie 2 days later. The investigation that followed was not brief, and I will not pretend I understood every step of it. What I understood was that my nephew and Courtney were both interviewed, that the forged physician's assessment was traced to a document preparation service in Mississauga, with a previous fraud complaint on file, and that my nephew had retained the Barry solicitor with the specific intention of using the guardianship petition as leverage to compel the property transfer. That constituted, Helen told me, fraud, elder abuse under Section 2, one of the Ontario Seniors Secretariat guidelines, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. My nephew was charged. Courtney was charged as a secondary party. The Barry solicitor faced a Law Society complaint and a separate civil action. None of this resolved quickly or cleanly. These things never do. But it resolved, which is the word that matters. I want to be honest about the grief because otherwise this is just a story about property law, and it is not only that. My nephew is my brother's son. I drove 40 minutes through a February snowstorm to be at the hospital when he was born. I taught him to read a tape measure when he was 6 years old, standing in this same yard with sawdust on my boots and too much patience for him to understand at the time. He had a gap in his front teeth until he was 9 that made him look like a question mark when he smiled, and I have a photograph of him on the mantelpiece from a family Christmas where he is holding a toy train set I gave him and looking at it with the particular wonder that children have when something mechanical is working correctly. That photograph is still on the mantelpiece. I have not moved it, and I do not intend to. My brother did not know what his son had done until the OPP contacted him. He called me the night after they came to see him, and we talked for a long time. I will not share what was said in that conversation. It was between my brother and me, and it belongs to us. I will say only that it was one of the harder conversations of my life, and that my brother is not his son, and that I know this, and that knowing it does not make any of it easier. Margaret came home from the hospital on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of November. I had the wood stove going and soup on the back burner and the afternoon light coming through the south windows, the way it does in late fall in Grey County, flat and gold and longer than you expect, lying across the kitchen floor in a way that always made Margaret stop and look at it before she took her coat off. She stopped. She looked. Then she looked at me. She said, "You knew this was coming." I said I had thought it was possible and had hoped I was wrong. She walked over to the table and sat down in her chair, the one closer to the stove, because she runs cold. And she looked around the kitchen, at the cabinet I had built in 1993, and the floor I had laid by hand, and the window over the sink that looks out onto the yard, and the bush beyond it, and the 43 acres of Ontario hardwood, still entirely ours in the November cold. She said, "How long have you been planning for this?" I said Helen helped me set up the trust about 1.5 years ago. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the recorder?" I said, 4 months. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. Margaret has the particular quality, which I have always considered one of her finest, of being able to sit with difficult information without immediately needing to do something with it. After a while she said that she understood why I had not told her, and that she wished I had, and that in the future she would like to know about these things. I said I understood. She said she knew it was difficult for me to involve her in something I was trying to protect her from. I said that was exactly it. She said she knew, but still. We had soup. The wood stove ticked and settled. Outside, the first real snow of the season was starting, the kind that comes sideways in Gray County and fills the yard by morning. I watched it through the window and thought about my nephew, and about the conversation with my brother, and about the photograph on the mantelpiece, and about the way certain people look at land and see only what they could sell it for, and the way other people look at the same land and see everything that was built on it and everything that has not yet been built. There is one thing people ask when they hear this story, and people do hear it, because a town in Gray County is not a large place, and news of an OPP visit to a property travels the way it always has, by word of mouth over coffee in the hardware store. They ask why I did not tell Margaret about the trust, about the recorder, about what I had been quietly putting in place for a year and a half. They ask if she was upset with me for keeping it from her. I told Margaret the truth, which is that I am a carpenter by training and by temperament, and carpenters do not build structures they hope will hold. They build structures designed to hold, regardless of what is asked of them. I had seen what my nephew was doing 12 months before he knew I had seen it, and I had spent those 12 months putting in place everything that needed to be in place without telling Margaret, because I did not want her to spend any part of her life bracing for a collapse that might not arrive. She has a heart condition. She has enough to carry. She listened to this. Then she said she supposed she understood, but that she was his aunt too, and that she had a right to know when her own family was trying to take her home, and that the next time something like this was happening, she expected to be part of the conversation from the beginning. I said I sincerely hoped there would not be a next time. She said she knew, but still. We went through everything together on a Sunday afternoon in December, spread across the kitchen table. The trust documents, the land registry certificate, a copy of the injunction, the recorder, the updated will that Helen had drafted, which now includes a detailed exclusion of my nephew and Courtney from any inheritance, along with a substantial donation to a provincial organization that supports older adults navigating financial exploitation and elder abuse in Ontario. Helen told me on the phone when I described what I wanted to include in the new will that in 22 years of practice, she had never had a client who responded to attempted fraud by immediately establishing a legacy gift to an elder abuse organization. I told her that was probably because most of her clients had not been carpenters and did not have the particular habit of building things designed to outlast the threat they were built against. She said that was probably true. The property is still ours. That is the sentence everything else depends on. I walk the perimeter most mornings before Margaret is up, out through the woodlot and down to the creek and back along the fence line to the house. 43 acres of Gray County that I paid $68,000 for in 1986 and that no one was able to take, not for a forged assessment, not for a leather folder full of papers, not for any of the careful, patient pressure that had been applied for the better part of a year. I walk the fence line and I check the posts and I look at the bush and I think about what it means to build something that holds. Real security, I have come to understand, is not in a locked door. A locked door is only ever as strong as the frame it sits in. Real security is in everything you do before someone decides to try the door in the first place. The forethought, the documentation, the call placed the night before, the quiet Tuesday afternoon with your solicitor 18 months ago, going over options you hoped you would never need. Real security is a recorder in a shirt pocket because you loved your wife enough not to make her watch you lose everything, and because you built your house with your own hands, and you know the difference between something built to last and something built to look like it might. They thought they were walking into a kitchen. They walked into 38 years of preparation. And this land, this house, these 43 acres of hardwood bush in Gray County with the creek running through the lower third and the wraparound porch, I milled myself. It was here before they tried, and it is here after, and it will be here after me, which was the whole point from the beginning. I go inside. I start the coffee. I listen to the house settle in the way old timber frame houses settle in a Canadian winter, shifting slightly against the cold, the joinery finding its place, the beams carrying the load they were built to carry. Margaret will be up in an hour. I will have coffee ready and the stove banked up and the light coming through the south windows the way it does in December, low and long across the kitchen floor. I think about my nephew. I think about the boy with the gap in his teeth looking at a toy train with pure, uncomplicated wonder, and I think about the man who arrived at my door with a leather folder And I hold both of those truths at the same time because they are both true, and I am old enough to know that people contain more than one version of themselves, and that the version that wins is the one they choose. I chose, a long time ago, to build things that hold. Everything else follows from that.